A police officer runs through empty streets, his canine bleeding out in his arms. Every second meant life or death. But when he finally reached help, what they told him changed everything. How much can one dog endure to stay alive? All right, before we jump in, drop your dog's name in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. The city never truly slept. Its pulse hummed in the background, engines growling under the streetlights, sirens wailing in the distance, neon lights flickering above shuttered stores. Yet beneath that noise, under the concrete bones of a highway overpass on the city's east side, something quieter and more ominous stirred. Officer Brian Holt guided his cruiser down the desolate service road, his canine partner Shadow seated beside him. The Belgian Malinois was wide awake, his posture straight, his amber eyes alert to everything beyond the windows. The call had come through just 20 minutes earlier. A vague report of movement near a fenced utility yard, an odd time and place for activity. No known break-ins, no open warrants, but something about the dispatcher's voice stuck with Brian. She had sounded unsure, even hesitant, as if her instincts knew what her words could not say. The cruiser rolled to a halt. Headlights dimmed. Brian stepped out without killing the engine. The air was cold and sharp, hinting at a storm building in the mountains to the west. A thin mist crawled over the pavement, turning the city into something distant and unfamiliar. Shadow leapt from the cruiser with silent precision, landing beside Brian like a ghost in the fog. Together, they moved toward the narrow alley that led to the fence line. Shadow sniffed the air, then stopped abruptly. His muscles tightened. Brian's grip on his flashlight changed. He followed the dog's lead as they moved closer. They passed a cluster of discarded shopping carts, then the rusted shell of an old vending machine. Nothing moved. Then came the sound, subtle but sharp. Metal scraping against gravel, not the wind, not a cat, something too intentional. Brian raised the flashlight. Shadow darted forward, silent and certain. That was when everything went wrong. From the shadows behind a storage container came a flash of motion, too fast to identify but fast enough to raise alarm. A figure emerged, then another. Brian shouted, instinct kicking in, but there was no time for protocol. The first figure raised something. Brian ducked as the metal pipe swung toward him, but the second figure had already moved past. Heading straight for Shadow, the dog lunged without hesitation. The fight was brutal and fast, over in seconds. Shadow tackled the second figure, teeth bared, dragging the assailant to the ground. Brian saw the man's arm reach around. Something glinted in his hand. Then came the crack, gunfire. Shadow let out a sound Brian had never heard before. Not a bark, not a growl. A deep, guttural cry that ripped through the alley like a siren. Brian fired back, his training pushing through the blur. The first suspect fled. The second lay still, weapon dropped. But Brian was already moving to Shadow. The dog lay twisted on the ground, his chest heaving. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading fast. Brian dropped to his knees, hands shaking as he checked for the wound. The bullet had torn through Shadow's lower torso. Not a clean exit. Blood loss was already severe. There was no time to wait for backup. Brian hoisted Shadow into his arms, rising with difficulty. The dog was heavier than he remembered, or maybe adrenaline distorted time and weight. He turned toward the cruiser, only to find the alleyway blocked. Somehow, in the chaos, the patrol car had been rammed by the suspect's vehicle, its side crushed inward, wheels tilted uselessly. The radio on his belt crackled, but he ignored it. He had no choice. The emergency vet hospital was 6 blocks away, close by vehicle, but not now, not tonight, not with Shadow fading in his arms. So Brian ran, boots pounding the cracked pavement, arms trembling under Shadow's weight. He ran through the haze of sirens and lightless streets, the city blurred around him. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was not thinking about the suspects anymore, not about his badge or reports or policy, only about the rise and fall of Shadow's chest, and how shallow that rise was becoming. The first block was easy. Adrenaline masked the weight, masked the pain in Brian's leg from where the pipe had grazed him. He cut through alleys, past dumpsters and chain-link fences, slipping between parked cars. Shadow did not move, no twitch, no sound. By the second block, Brian's arms began to give out. Sweat soaked his uniform, despite the cold. His vision narrowed, pulse hammering in his ears louder than anything else. He gritted his teeth, adjusted his hold, and kept moving. He reached a narrow pedestrian overpass. The staircase twisted upward like a spiral fracture of concrete. Brian looked up once, just once, then pressed forward, carrying Shadow up each step like a broken promise. Somewhere above, the hum of the freeway echoed like distant thunder. At the top, his legs gave out. He collapsed to one knee, barely catching himself before hitting the ground entirely. He checked Shadow again, still breathing but weaker. The thought hit him like a knife he might not make it. For a moment, Brian felt everything stop. The wind died down. The sound of the city fell away. There was only him and the dying dog in his arms, the same dog who had pulled him from a river 2 winters ago, who had sniffed out 3 missing children during a flood response, who had once taken a knife meant for Brian in a corner store robbery. Shadow was more than a partner. He was his reason to still believe the job mattered. Brian rose again. Lock 3 came with chaos. A fire truck passed at the far end of the street, horn blaring. People turned to look. Some stared, confused. No one offered help. He kept running. His steps turned to a stumble, but he never stopped. By the 4th block, he began to lose sensation in his arms. His back screamed with strain. His vision wavered. Shadow's breathing faltered. Brian did not pray. He did not believe in signs or fate or redemption, but he whispered words under his breath anyway. Words he did not remember saying. Maybe just Shadow's name. Maybe nothing at all. A street lamp flickered overhead as he entered the 5th block. The road was torn up for construction, barricades everywhere. He wove through them, almost slipping on a patch of loose gravel. A passing cyclist shouted something at him, maybe asking if he was all right, maybe not. It did not matter. At the 6th block, the clinic came into view, the red neon cross glowing dimly above the door like a lifeline. But the last 100 yards felt longer than the entire night. Brian pushed forward 1 step at a time. His boots scraped concrete. His arms trembled violently now. He thought he might drop Shadow before reaching the door, but he did not. He slammed through the glass entryway shoulder first. The front desk nurse looked up, startled, confused. Then she saw the blood, the limp body in his arms. She shouted something to the back. Scrubs and voices exploded into action. A gurney appeared. Arms reached to take Shadow, but Brian held on another second. He lowered him gently, like setting down something sacred. Then he stepped back, hands covered in blood. His knees finally buckled. He did not hit the floor. Someone caught him. Voices faded in and out. He could not make out the words. He only knew that he had made it. But whether it had been soon enough, that remained unknown. As the emergency room doors closed behind Shadow, Brian sat slumped in a waiting chair, blood drying on his sleeves. His eyes burned, but he refused to close them. The image of Shadow's body on that cold alley floor replayed in his mind like a broken film reel. The receptionist tried to talk to him. He heard her say something about paperwork, something about incident forms. He did not move, did not answer. All he could think was, "Please hold on. Please do not leave me like this. Not after everything." The smell of antiseptic soaked the air. It clung to everything, the worn linoleum floors, the pale blue chairs that lined the walls, the metal reception desk with its computer screens casting a cold glow over tired faces. It even soaked into Brian's uniform, replacing the blood and sweat and street dust that had marked his frantic run. But it could not wash away what was beneath. Shadow was somewhere behind those emergency room doors, silent and still. Brian sat alone in the corner of the waiting room, slouched forward, his elbows on his knees, hands pressed together as if in prayer, though he had no faith in anything but the dog he had carried for 6 city blocks. The image of Shadow gasping for air, muscles twitching in agony, his eyes dulling with every second, was carved deep behind Brian's eyes. Time blurred, minutes slid into one another without warning. People came and went. A woman clutching a limp cat, a man with a pit bull wrapped in bandages, a child holding a rabbit in a shoebox. But Brian remained motionless. A vet tech emerged once, looking for someone else. Not him. Another hour passed. No word. He closed his eyes, trying not to remember the blood on Shadow's fur, trying not to hear the sound he made after the gunshot, a sound no living creature should ever make. Brian had been through stabbings, shootings, high-speed chases, but nothing had ever shaken him like that. The receptionist eventually brought him a water bottle. She said something kind, probably. Brian nodded vaguely. His throat was so dry he could barely swallow. He turned to the clock on the wall. Still no update. Still no word if Shadow was alive. He rose slowly. Every part of his body ached. His back screamed from the weight he had carried. His left leg throbbed from where the suspect had grazed him with a pipe. But none of that mattered. Only Shadow mattered. He walked to the reception desk. Before he could speak, the receptionist looked up and gave a quiet nod, as if she had expected this moment. "They're still working," she said gently. "The vet will come out as soon as they can." He nodded once, then sat back down. But his mind didn't. It raced backward to a time not so long ago when Shadow was new, barely trained, full of energy, a little wild around the edges. Brian remembered the first day of K-9 school. He had not wanted a partner, not after his last one had retired, broken and tired. He was ready to work solo. But then came Shadow, a blur of tan fur, black muzzle, and defiant eyes. Everyone said the dog was too aggressive, too unsteady, but Brian saw something else, pain channeled into drive. Shadow needed direction, not rejection. So did Brian, if he was honest. They had formed a bond faster than anyone expected. Shadow learned quickly. He obeyed not because of commands, but because of trust. Brian never needed to shout, just a look, a gesture. They worked as one. No hesitation. Until tonight. The doors to the surgical unit finally opened again. A woman in green scrubs stepped through, removing latex gloves from her hands. Her face was pale and drawn, dark rings under her eyes. She scanned the room until her gaze landed on Brian. He stood up before she could speak. "Shadow is still alive," she said without preamble. "We managed to stabilize him, barely." Brian's chest caved in around the breath he had been holding for over 3 hours. "But the bullet hit low," she continued. "It missed the heart, but clipped a section of the liver. Significant blood loss. We've transfused and managed to stop most of the bleeding. But he's critical. He's on oxygen. The next few hours are vital." Brian swallowed hard. He wanted to ask questions, wanted to demand certainty. but he could not find the words. All he could do was nod. The vet stepped closer, her expression softening. You got him here just in time. Another 10 minutes, and I don't think he would have made it. He exhaled. Not quite relief. More like the edge of hope. You can see him. But just for a moment. She led him through the heavy door. The hallway smelled even sharper here, chemicals and steel. The lights buzzed above. Too white, too sterile. Everything felt fragile. They passed cages, monitoring stations, a wheeled cart with blood bags and syringes. At the far end of the room, Shadow lay on a table surrounded by soft bedding, a series of tubes trailing from his side. Bandages covered his midsection, and a transparent oxygen mask was fitted to his snout. His eyes were closed, his body still, but he was breathing. Brian stepped close, the world narrowing down to that one small rise and fall of his partner's chest. He reached out, hesitated, then gently rested a hand on the dog's head. Shadow did not stir, but his ears twitched slightly. Just once. Brian felt something catch in his throat. He remained there for several minutes. The vet stood a few feet back, saying nothing. Eventually, she placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. He's asleep. He won't know you're here. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Brian nodded, still not speaking. Then he turned and left the room, the weight of the night pressing harder now that adrenaline was no longer holding him up. Back in the waiting room, he sat again, but this time with something different. Not peace. Not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. By dawn, the storm they had predicted finally rolled in. Rain pattered softly against the glass doors, and a faint rumble of thunder passed over the city skyline. Brian had not moved from the chair in nearly 2 hours. He was exhausted beyond words, but sleep would not come. A vet tech walked by, then returned. He's stable for now, she said. Still unconscious, but his vitals are improving. Brian closed his eyes, let the words sink in. Still not safe, but not gone. He got up and moved to the window, watching the rain. His mind kept returning to the alley, the ambush, the way Shadow had leapt into danger, knowing the risk, the way the city had blurred around him as he ran with everything he loved bleeding out in his arms. This was more than a job, more than a partner. It always had been. Behind him, the receptionist approached again. There was a call, she said. Your precinct. They were checking on you both. Brian turned. He had not told anyone where he had gone after the incident. The last they had heard, he was calling in backup. But after the gunshot, all that had vanished. There had only been one priority. He took out his phone. It was dead. The receptionist handed him the clinic's phone. Brian made the call. Captain Mendez answered on the second ring. You alive? Brian paused. Shadow is stable. Barely. Silence. Then, you need anything? Brian looked around the waiting room. He shook his head. No. We're all right for now. We've got officers canvassing. We'll find the other one. Not worried about that. Another pause. Take care of your dog, Brian. Then the line went dead. He returned the phone. The receptionist just nodded and let him be. At noon, Shadow opened his eyes. A nurse came to find Brian within minutes. He was at the dog's side in seconds, not saying a word. Shadow's gaze was unfocused at first, then steadied. His ears barely moved. His breathing picked up slightly, enough to signal recognition. Brian lowered himself beside the recovery bed, his hand resting gently on the dog's paw. Shadow didn't whine, he didn't wag. But his eyes didn't leave Brian's. They didn't need to. For the first time in over 12 hours, Brian felt something settle inside him. It was not over. Not yet. But they had made it through the night, and together they would face whatever came next. The clinic room was still. No beeping machines, no bustle of emergency hands, just the soft hum of a portable oxygen unit, the rhythmic sound of a fan rotating overhead, and the muted heartbeat of a morning slowly waking up outside the window. Shadow lay still on the padded recovery bed. The blanket tucked around him barely shifted with each breath, but it did move, steady, slow, stubborn. His eyes, half-lidded and watchful, flicked toward the man seated beside him. Brian had not left. 3 days had passed since the night everything fell apart. 3 days of pacing sterile hallways, drinking coffee that never stayed warm long enough, and refusing every suggestion to go home and rest. He had slept in a plastic chair, eaten 2 vending machine granola bars, and said fewer words in those 72 hours than he normally said in a single day on duty. But he had not moved from Shadow's side. There had been setbacks, a blood pressure dip, a reaction to antibiotics, a fever that spiked just long enough to send a ripple of panic through the veterinary staff. Each time, Brian had gripped Shadow's paw just a little tighter. Now, as the dog's tail gave its first weak twitch since surgery, Brian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Progress. Real, undeniable progress. The vet came in mid-morning, clipboard in hand. Dr. Lynn, calm, methodical. She had led the surgery, led the triage, and never once sugar-coated the truth. She crouched beside the bed, checking the IV line, inspecting the dressings. "You'll be happy to hear we're moving him off oxygen tomorrow," she said. "His lungs are strong enough on their own now." Ryan nodded, eyes never leaving Shadow. "He's past the worst," she added. "But you need to understand, recovery's going to be slow. Weeks, maybe longer. Scar tissue, muscle loss. He may never run like he used to." "I'm not asking him to," Brian said quietly. She studied him for a second, then stood. "I'll give you both some time." By that afternoon, Shadow was sitting up, just barely. His legs trembled. He needed help getting into position, but he did it. And Brian could feel the difference in the way he looked at him. Not just recognition anymore, but will. That same fierce spark he had seen on the first day of training, the spark that said, "Try me, I will not quit." Later that night, Shadow took a step, then another. It was wobbly, uncertain, and ended in a careful collapse back onto his bedding. But it was a step. The nurse watching from the doorway blinked twice, smiled, and turned away without saying a word. Because she knew what that moment meant to both of them. The next week blurred into a series of small victories. Shadow regained more control of his legs. His appetite returned. He growled softly at the vacuum cleaner in the hallway, a sound Brian never thought he'd be happy to hear again. Each improvement was celebrated in quiet gestures, a hand on the scruff, a soft word, a nod. No fireworks, just the bond that had always been there, silent, strong, and unshakable. On the 10th day, Brian took him outside. The back courtyard of the vet clinic was enclosed by a low brick wall with just enough space for walking and sunbathing. Brian helped Shadow to his feet, guiding him slowly across the grass. The dog paused halfway through the circuit and looked up at him. The light in his eyes was back, and Brian knew he was coming home. They discharged Shadow that Sunday. It had been raining all morning, but by the time they walked out of the clinic, the sky had cleared, and a streak of sun cut through the clouds like a spotlight. Brian helped Shadow into the back of his personal truck, using the same ramp he had once sworn they'd never need. Shadow looked out the window during the ride, calm, alert. When they reached home, he hesitated at the front door. Not out of fear, just cautious memory. Brian knelt beside him and waited. Shadow stepped through on his own. The first days back were hard. Shadow could not climb stairs. He needed help getting onto his bed. Nightmares hit hard, sudden jolts in his sleep, low growls echoing through the dark. Brian stayed close. He left the TV off, kept the radio silent. Every sound was too much. The walls of the house became a quiet sanctuary, and slowly the dog healed. Not just physically, though his wounds did close and his steps grew steadier, but something deeper mended too. The fear lessened, the edge softened, and the tail began to wag again. A month later, Brian brought Shadow back to the precinct. Not for duty, not yet. Just a visit. The moment they stepped through the doors, the room fell silent. Officers paused mid-conversation, half-drunk coffee cups forgotten, paperwork left hanging mid-air. Then came the applause, quiet at first, then louder. No one said much. There was no need to. The look in every eye said enough. They had all heard the story about the ambush, the bullet, the 6 blocks of pain and grit and loyalty carried in 2 shaking arms. They had all known Shadow. They had all feared the worst. Now they saw the miracle standing in front of them, scarred, slow-moving, but alive. Captain Mendez approached, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "Well," he said, "you look like hell." Brian cracked the smallest smile. "Good to see you too, sir." The captain knelt, hand extended. Shadow sniffed it, then gave a slow lick. "That's the same dog," Mendez muttered, rising. No doubt about it, but Brian could see it in his face, the unspoken question. Will he return? Will he work again? Will he trust the field, the job, the risk? Brian didn't answer it, because neither of them knew yet, and that was all right. The following week, Shadow's trainer from K9 Academy stopped by the house. He brought a bag of old training gear, chew ropes, cones, a weathered bite sleeve. Brian set them out in the backyard without expectation. He threw a rope toy once. Shadow didn't chase it, but the second time he moved. Not fast, not strong, but with intention. Brian watched, silent, heart tight. Shadow reached the rope, sniffed it, then nudged it back toward him. No barking, no performance. Just try me. It took nearly 2 months before Brian dared bring Shadow near the training course again. Not the public one, a small private setup behind the precinct, built for evaluations. It was early morning. No one was around. Just concrete and cones and silence. Shadow stepped onto the course on his own. The first hurdle he stopped in front of. Brian said nothing, waited. Shadow backed up, then with careful motion leapt. By the time he finished, Brian was on one knee, hand on Shadow's back, not saying anything. There were no cheers, no music, just the wind in the trees and the sound of breath, steady, deep. When the day came to decide whether Shadow would return to duty, Brian sat with him under the shade of the big oak tree behind the precinct. The folder was in his hand, the final report, the clearance forms, the choice. Not high, not perfect, but over. One by one he made his way through. By the time he finished, Brian was on one knee, hand on Shadow's back, not saying anything. There were no cheers, no music, just the wind in the trees and the sound of breath, steady, deep. When the day came to decide whether Shadow would return to duty, Brian sat with him under the shade of the big oak tree behind the precinct. The folder was in his hand, the final report, the clearance forms, the choice, retire him or return him. Shadow rested beside him, watching a bird move across the lawn. Brian looked down at the dog who had once leapt in front of a bullet meant for him, and knew what to do. They returned to duty together. Not every shift, not full time, but enough. Shadow had changed. So had Brian. They no longer chased adrenaline. They no longer rushed toward noise. Instead, they were assigned to search and recovery, missing persons, community work, and Shadow thrived. He found a lost girl during a forest search 2 weeks in. She had fallen behind on a hike. The family cried when they saw the dog leading officers to her. Brian never said a word. He just knelt beside his partner, ran a hand down his fur, and smiled. A year later, the department hosted a ceremony. There were plaques, speeches, cameras. Shadow was named an official department hero, not for one incident, but for everything, for loyalty, for bravery, for surviving. When the crowd clapped, Shadow stood tall beside Brian, head high, eyes calm, and when the photos were taken, Brian did not smile for the cameras. He just looked down at his partner, the one he had carried through the night, the one who had carried him ever since. If you like these kind of stories, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss the next unbelievable bond between a hero and their dog.